the cloud. And I think we talked at length about Henry Ford because he was the one who could say that there was a quote that I sent out in the bonus slide that one reporter had asked him, says, well, Mr. Ford, aren't your views a little bit outside, out of a view with the step with the modern age? Says, young man, I invented modern age. And he's right in a sense. I say he's spot on, basically. So, and we talked about how he was a complicated man. He was anti-Semite and, really, had newspapers published, but then he finally apologized. And so it was some interesting story. And he controlled the production system from raw material to this thing. So something that we're still struggling with now. Okay, so all of you remember this song probably, I think, so he just passed away within last 24 hours. And it just ties in, because this was a popular song, for the Edmund Fitzgerald. And it ties in with the iron core industry type thing. When I was practicing in Green Bay, we used to get a lot of patients from Upper Michigan. And you could tell from the name that they were Italians, And, I used to just, you can't tell them, but I said, Jewish, somebody with the name Alexandrini, can you imagine how miserable it would be coming out from Europe, and living in UP? I mean, this is, they're from Mediterranean people, and, but that's the only place where they could find jobs. And so it was an amazing, you look at the lifestyle, I mean, that we used to feel sorry in Green Bay for people from the Upper Michigan, say, okay, yeah, we only got 7 inches of snow, but they had 2 feet of snow. So, but you just see those people with the iron industry type of thing, and I will travel through Upper Michigan, type of thing, and it's a totally different climate type of thing, like it's a what phone signal, you can still, but it's an interesting things as to how the supply chain was from iron mining was. So this was a song that that just brings that memory. I just thought I just put that in as a slide as a memory jogger to see how the industrial empire, the raw materials of the United States were incorporated, and a lot of the iron ore was sent to a River Rouge plant that Henry Ford owned. Okay. At the same time, this was obviously the trivia that one can discover was Jalopy. It's a town in the city of a capital state of Veracruz. That's where all the old cars used to go. So that's how the name came about. So I mean,
Bharat, do you think you're sharing your screen, because we're not?
Oh, I'm sorry.
It.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Just a second. I think Yeah. I have to. I hit the wrong button, so I have to the wrong. Okay. Screen 2. Okay, that was the whole, and optimize for video clip. Okay, you got it now?
No.
Okay.
Not yet.
Okay, yeah.
Now it's working. Yeah.
Okay, yeah. Thanks for pointing it out. Yeah, because I think I was showing you the camera for my thing, so I was on screen 1, so I had to switch to screen 2. Okay, so we talked about Gordon Lightfoot, but this is the real first slide, type of thing as to this is how the name came about, city of Jalapa, and that's how the old cars were being sent down to be unloaded, so that's for the Mexican market. So that's how the name came into about. So many of the second-hand cars showed up over there as a final destination. So that's how the name has stuck into the regular dictionary, so to speak. Okay, and we talked about how the Model T has become part of the culture also. That well-known writer E.B. White, after so in 1936, after the Model T had stopped production line, or had changed, wrote a essay on farewell to Model T, and he'd also composed an essay that was published in the New Yorker, From Sea to Shining Sea, in Traveling in the Car. And you can see the book cover, and obviously everybody can recognize this, So it was like it was identified, he described as a mechanically uncanny generation identified with the youth, with excitement and traveling. So he traveled in 1927 for 7 months, retooling the car and then also again, it has been Will Rogers and everybody else had praised the car. So it became part of the cultural history. Okay. And now this is Goodyear and vulcanization. We talked about tires and Firestone earlier. There was the early start, and there was obviously the car and tires went together, but Goodyear and vulcanization. Now, this is not the vulcanization we are talking about, by the way. Okay. This is what we're talking about. So this was, now let's see if this video plays, a little, oops, sorry, no, I think I had to. No, I think somehow I cannot play the video type of thing. So, but okay, Charles Goodyear. Yeah, I think it was just an image. Sorry, my mistake. It goes. So he was an American self-taught chemist and a manufacturing engineer who developed the process of vulcanized rubber, for which it received a patent, in 1844. So before car industry really took off. His father was a descendant of Goodyear Company, London merchants who founded the colony of New Haven. So the English roots go back, to the the Mayflower days, so to speak. So this was the process of adding sulfur and making the rubber more stiff. So that was, and that changed the whole, car industry to a dramatic extent, because otherwise people had to travel with number of tires when on any long journey, and that was a common occurrence. And again, this was the Ford's adventure into South America to control manufacturing process, and he actually established a town in Brazil, and because this was controlled by the rubber barons of Europe in jungle, and then again, and then it was a way for controlling, but the whole process fell apart because the British Empire, a guy named Henry Wickham, he smuggled thousands of rubber plants, initially to the Kew Garden and then to their colonies in Southeast Asia, primarily Malaya and the Malayan Peninsula, that type of thing. So that just the whole industry just fell apart, type thing. And again, the rubber barons were classed by themselves. There's a weird movie. One of the German movie makers, had made called Fitzcarraldo. Okay, it was a movie about explorer about the rubber business who actually wants to create a tributary from the Amazon River, and it's like he also wants to put an orchestra there. So he carries a whole ship and an orchestra across this jungles type things. It's a bizarre movie if you're interested in that sort of thing. So he's carrying about the Ucayali River, a tributary of Amazon, which was cut off from the Atlantic port. So he wanted to build a canal rover. So it's interesting tidbits on how the rubber industry and the northern part of Brazil was absolutely like a mini Europe with the rich rubber barons, and they're like a historical part of Brazilian history as to how people became amazingly rich. Okay, yeah, I am recording, so good. Yes, I just wanted to make sure that it was not, because I don't have that little icon up. Oh yeah, it's on the lower right corner. Okay, got it. So okay, and then again with this thing, obviously, initially people with the cars, they used to get their petrol or fuel or gasoline, as the correct word would be, from the pharmacist. But then obviously the need, there was a need for a specific filling station, and just on the tails of the early car industry, the filling stations came into being as early as 1905, and this is an ad for that. You can just see as to how it just started out, and this is Fort Wayne, Indiana. But again, a lot of the same industry started out in Midwest because the sort of industrial rust belt, as we derogatorily call it nowadays, and in the first, some of the other stations came out in Pittsburgh and then in Seattle by 1907, and then again, so there are a dramatic rise of started, and again at that time, there were combined this thing that the histories could have been a little different because the Model T was capable of dual use. Okay, but then again at that time in 1862, there was a tax on alcohol, and the conglomerate of Standard Oil came into existence, and with the further discovery of further oils in Texas and starting from Pennsylvania and Texas, it changed dramatically. And again, it became the controversy between farmland versus automobile industry and petroleum type thing. So that was, so ethanol was considered a reasonably viable alternative, but then General Motors would have had to invest a lot into the farms, and they did not control the sources at that time. So that was a different. So they were going on a more chemistry-based route, and they were, against. And by the way, the tax was introduced on alcohol to pay for the Civil War. Okay, and that was a substantial tax imposed. Okay, and at the same time, the rise of kerosene was coming into existence, and moving forward, so we've gone a full circle with now alcohol-based fuel, and that's again an interesting sidekick that you may or may not have thought about. Because when Archer Daniel Midlands, one of the big producers of high fructose corn syrup, which is the cause of massive obesity campaign, and the supersizing that we have seen, which we talked about in the medical classes, and the wet milling process, has a side product of ethanol. So that's why they started a shrewd search to create a market for it. And obviously, with the fuel crisis and other things, it was, with the Arab oil embargo, they were at the right time. They were. So now, obviously, at any gas stations now, you can get the added, and the various regulations have been passed, and the initial subsidy that was given, has now subsided. So it's an interesting story how the economics, the world politics, and everything has been involved in this thing. And that was, you may recognize the word cure for knocking. Okay, so, and that's a different type of knocking, because that was a part of the initial engine with the gasoline engine type of thing. And again, here's a slide from the early days of how dry corn alcohol gasoline. So this is, goes back to the early days of car industry. And just to make it a point that in the United States, we have ethanol from corn, while on the other hand, Brazilians use sugarcane. But all of these, have their own. There's nothing like a free lunch. A lot of the alcohol used that was used with sugarcane, that also degenerates into aldehyde. So that has effect on the ozone layer as well. So there is, there is no easy source. So there is going to be some price that you're going to pay for mass consumption. Again, and then speaking of aldehydes, that this is just a sidekick for, as a physician, I have to keep my physician hat on, that a lot of the Asians, that means not Asians like Indian Asians, but Southeast Asians, the Japanese and the Chinese, they have a genetic abnormality with alcohol dehydrogenase, aldehyde dehydrogenase. And that's why they get the flushing when they drink alcohol, that they cannot metabolize it adequately. So I thought I'll throw in a trivia for that purpose type thing. Okay, so we talked about this, and okay. And the other word that, it's not too much used in nowadays anymore is jitneys, which if you have served in the Navy in the Philippines, you recognize in the Philippines, the jitneys are still very much in vogue. And they were in vogue in United States also, that people were giving rides to others and then again, they competed with street cars, and the establishment, again, there was obviously a fight for as to who makes the revenue from that. And so that's when the jitneys finally, folded type thing. And by the early use that started in 1910, and by the numbers declined from as much as 60,000 to 6,000 nationwide. So, and there was also actually even a play written by a playwright named August Wilson about jitneys. And last but not the least, for traveling culture, I just thought, obviously, I'm sure some of you have seen the movie Green Book, as to how America's original, I hate to use the word sin, but that sin or issue that the race, had it affected dramatically in traveling. And there was a very, very well done movie about, an African American piano player traveling, giving concerts all over South. and he hires a big muscle man and a bouncer type of person. So there was and there actually was, and just for trivia fans, Green Book was one of the clues on Jeopardy about a few months ago, by the way. Okay, and this brings us to the knocking problem, because with this spontaneous ignition before electrical spark created high pressure in the engine, and that was possible to cause damage. And again, it had a lot to do with the compression ratio and inside, and varieties of other agents were tried, but they were expensive, such as putting selenium, which is not a very common metal type of thing. And so, Thomas Medgley, who was actually a Cornell-based engineer, okay, and he worked for General Motors in the early days, and he worked on the knocking problem, and he came up with the ingenious solution of adding a small part of lead, to prevent the knocking. And obviously, now as any scientist worth his or her salt would know that lead was toxic from the Roman days. In fact, it has been hypothesized as one of the causes for decline of Roman Empire. Okay, but again, that there was a huge amount of financial incentive to prevent the knocking problem. And again, they did not control the ethanol production, but adding lead, they could control at the source, and with the collaboration of Standard Oil and the car manufacturing company, they did a small study, says, oh, yeah, the small amount is not harmful. And the study was done with relatively small number of people. And some of those workers said, oh, yeah, we'll see, nothing happened to us. And even Thomas Midgley, said he, so it's actually got passed type of thing. And he again, was the spokesman, as it happens when you're employed by the industry type of thing. So, and they finally were able to push it through. And even though there was an isolated voice against with the potential for lead toxicity by a woman physician named Alice Hamilton, okay, but again, she was outvoted, and the financiers won. So so it's starting very quickly, and as early as February of 23, filling stations stored the first tank of leaded gasoline. Okay, and at that time, when lo and behold, and unknown to the public, Midgley was in bed with lead poisoning. Okay, and there were some backlashes against this thing, that 5 workers had died from tetraethyl, which you may remember, the ethyl corporation exposure at Standard Oil refinery in New Jersey. But still, the sales went on, and in fact, there is no reason to prohibit the sales of leaded gasoline as long as the workers were protected when they made it. Okay, let the next generation worried about it. He did eventually suffer lead poisoning. So, and you can just see it took several decades for it to be removed, and to realize the potential danger to it. So it's this saga as to how the big corporations, got away with, with something that was very well known and was poorly researched. So, and I think, and just for, and as some of you from my other classes know, that Bill Bryson is one of my favorite authors. And in his book from 2003, which is a little dated, about the short history of nearly everything about science, he talks about Thomas Midgley as one of the most damaging engineer or scientist, as you could call it. He not only discovered lead, but he also discovered, chloroform, tetrachlorofluorines, Cl4. So they're depleting the ozone layer. Okay, so the two things, so it had a lot to do with the depletion of ozone layer as well as lead poisoning. Okay, fluorocarbons. I'm sorry, that's the correct word. I think not tetrafluorocarbons, but fluorocarbons. Which depleted the ozone layer. So you can say that as to how he's right up there with the guys who do the, ice pick craniotomy, type of things as terms of dangerous science, or Fritz Haber, the man who discovered, ammonia, the chemical synthesis of ammonia and fertilizer. But at the same time, we discovered poison gas. So the scientist who, can say the hall of shame, so to speak, Okay, so enough about that. Now, in terms of obviously with the cars, we needed roadways, and United States has some of the worst roads in the early days of automobile, because obviously, the land area of US is a lot bigger, and it's a newer area, so to speak, newer continent. So not surprising that we had poor roads in the early 20th century. But the Europeans had better roads, but still they were much more enthusiastic about racing. And that was, in Europe, at least in the early days of automobile, as we illustrated, this was a sport for the rich. It wasn't for the mass market like Model T, okay? And Model T was designed in such a way that has an elevated chassis, and the tires were more, much more forgiving for traveling on rough roads. So the Europeans needed better roads, and so this was one of the earliest starts of Autostrada dei Laghi, motorways of the lakes. So this was done by the Italians from Milan to the lakes, Okay, and so it was, made with concrete and mixed with bitumen, which in American English is asphalt, by the way. Okay, so this was the first proper roads as we would come to know it, type of thing. And so there is a like history link that for those of you who want to read about from the independent newspaper in UK. And then again, the Italians took the lead for building great. Mussolini, the great fascist dictator, he laid groundwork for the motorways. And then even before that, some of the Scotsmen and other people had done research on road building. And that's how the word tarmac came about, because a Scottish scientist engineer named John McAdam, okay, he had discovered the process of mixing crushed rock and tar. So it became, his name got incorporated into tarmac. And that's how the word entered the modern dictionary about tarmac. So this was, and some of the first roads that were built was in the United States was a Long Island tollway. But that was done primarily for racing, was built by one of the Vanderbilts. So it doesn't really count. It was not for the common people. And then later on, various dual carriageways were built at that time. And again, and Germany had training grounds, and we talked about Puricelli. So that was the start of the early roads. And then we'll talk more about the famous roads in the United States. Okay, and here they are. Okay, obviously, one can do a whole class on Route 66. That was it's a romantic and era, and histories and songs and movies have been made about Route 66, and it's still lovingly admired. It was built by 1926, so fairly soon after the about only 20, because obviously it's a lot of work through long territories. It's about 2,500 miles from Chicago to Los Angeles, and going through, Illinois, Missouri, Kansas, Oklahoma, Texas, and to compete again, obviously it didn't cover a large part of the East, which is where the large population was. So it was followed up by in 1913. It took several years to build, the Lincoln Highway. Lincoln Highway that started from Times Square all the way to Lincoln Park in San Francisco. So that is even a longer undertaking of about 3,390 miles. And this was started by one of the car industrialists named Carl Fisher. And, because obviously they were interested, they had vested interest in building a better way to travel. And so this was, the Lincoln Highway. Now it's incorporated in part of the National Highway System, which started in the Eisenhower era after the Second World War. Okay, so but these are the two main roads, that were, and obviously have some more other slides about the Ike project and the National Highway project. Okay, all right. Anybody has any questions or comments? I will, okay, if anybody has any personal experience on taking a trip on one of these routes, please chime in. Okay, now again, after we have said enough about Henry Ford, so we'll talk to the bigger corporation, which is, and I think, I don't know, some of you may have heard the jokes, but I think in the early days of Israel, obviously America was offering help to the new state of Israel, and so, and what type of military help you could give to Israel during the war, 1948 war. Okay, well, the Golda Meir just tongue-in-cheek replied, "I just want two generals, General Motors and General Electric." And so that would have been her wish to get the industrial base of Israel started. Okay, so and the story of General Motors could not be any different than that of Ford, who was a one-focused engineer and only one person behind the whole entire operation. On the other hand, General Motors was a conglomerate from the beginning. It was started by some real true capitalist, salesman, type of happy-go-lucky type of person named Mr. Durant. Okay, this is not him, by the way. Okay, and he was a born salesman. He started out, as a mechanic type of thing, and his base was in Flint, Michigan, which continues to feature in the General Motors saga. Okay, and he acquired initially the first of the several components of General Motors, started with Buick, and then he was really a wheeler dealer, in the manner of Gordon Gekko of Wall Street or Elon Musk of the modern era, and he had acquired several small manufacturing companies and consolidated into what came to be General Motors as early as 1908. So just about the same time. Okay, and he had even offered to buy a Ford. Okay, but somehow wrong, it did not work out. But otherwise, the history of American car manufacturing would have been different. And somehow he was able to charm his way through various banks, including the giant banking empires of J.P. Morgan and the likes, and the Vanderbilts. Okay, and so he's able to acquire, based on stock options and other ventures, varieties of company. And again, he was not a manufacturer himself, but he was able to acquire good talent, and he was able to team up with a well-known race driver who was French, by the way, as you can tell from the name that you well recognize, named Chevrolet. So by 1919, they had about 70 factories in 40 cities. So you can just imagine the exponential growth that they undertook. And by that time, it was the company that they built was worth $1 billion. That's just staggering as to how. So he traded in stocks and offered to buy a further company. But again, nobody was immune to the ups and downs of capitalism. And when the recession hit in 1920s, the stock went down from $420 to $20. Okay, and this did not go well with the who is who, or the financiers behind him, and which included none other than DuPont, which you may recognize the name from the DuPont chemical industry, which started out in Delaware. And again, they were also of French ancestry, by the way. And the starting people were, legitimate chemists and with degrees from MIT. And so they were not happy with this happy-go-lucky trading by Mr. Durant. And so they finally eased him out of it. And they appointed a real corporate manager, and a guy named Mr. Alfred Sloan, who was the face and the head of General Motors Corporation for several decades. And again, I think Bruce may remember him because he went to MIT, so I don't know if MIT still gives him credit for being an MIT student, and he again had started out with various engineering corporation, including, by the way, a name that you may recognize called Frigidaire, okay, which was, and so, and then again, he continued to head General Motors, but he had a totally different philosophy for manufacturing compared to Henry Ford. And I'll have some compare and contrast slides about him. Okay, and again, okay, let me jump one more. I think so. And this is the famous divisions of General Motors that you may recognize. You know, the Chevrolet, which we talked about, which was started by Durant and from Buick, who was a Scottish, one of the earliest divisions of General Motors. Okay, and then Cadillac, which was a small company that started out, you know, in 1908, and the name is based after Cadillac, who was the founder of, you know, Michigan or Detroit area. And so this is where they starts. And this is the famous headquarters of General Motors in downtown, you know, near north side of Detroit on the famous Woodward Avenue. And right across that, these four buildings, which are iconic and historic, this thing is the Henry Ford Hospital. So you can see how that one street in Detroit, which is where, and by the way, and main car manufacturers met at the famous Pontchartrain hotel in Detroit, you know, which has been remodeled and rebuilt in different forms now, and with the revival of Detroit. And but so these were the Motors headquarters that was designed by the famous architect named Alfred Kahn, K-A-H-N. And again, in spite of Henry Ford's anti-Semitism, he designed a lot of Henry Ford's factories and designed factories all over the world, including communist Russia. Okay, all right. So we talked about and the various components of General Motors, you know, and Chevrolet, by the way, was a French racer, and then again. And then again, he was eased out because by Mr. Durant, who was later on eased out by the DuPont and Mr. Sloan. Okay, and but so as we mentioned a little while ago, Buick was one of the earlier inventions that started as far back as 1854. He was born, and he invented something called overhead valve engine. Okay, and then Buick's has been one of the main divisions of General Motors. And for some reason, they're very popular in China for don't know why. And so there are varieties of, so these were a lot of self-taught Englishmen and Scotsmen type of thing. Okay. And again, then the problem that they had while competing with Model T was they did not have a low price car to compete with Model T. So then, so Mr. Sloan's great idea was to form each and every division, so to speak. So starting from the lowest end to the highest end, so that the customer would stay in the GM word for all along. As people became moved up the economic ladder, they could just say that they would stay with the GM product, more or less what Apple has copied that philosophy, or you know, AOL had that same philosophy in the early days of internet. Okay, so the same way people would start out with the low-end cars, you know, we're starting with Chevrolet and followed by Buick and moving up to a little more expensive car that no longer is being manufactured, called Oakland, then Oldsmobile, and moving up to the ultimate, the status symbol of American, we have arrived, so to speak, Cadillac. So this was the main philosophy, that a car for every purse and every purpose. So there was, and that played right into the object of desire as we have come to know it. Obviously, you know, I don't know if some of you were, you know, enamored, you know, like with cars, as a lot of teenagers were, as with the rise of car cultures post World War II. But that fitted right in with the human psychology, and they did employ various psychologists to see how to create a market for desire, so to speak. Instead of a utility function, it became an object of desire type of thing. And these are some of the buildings of General Motors. So they can see architecturally, this is, you know, Cadillac Pace, and this is the front entrance of the buildings. This is the interior, you know, it's still, one can see how it is being preserved for. And Mr. Albert Kahn was a son of a rabbi. And again, you know, he was a very talented engineer, to put it up in, to give him credit for his works. And now this is the big slide that I was talking about, the comparison. as Henry Ford's philosophy was automobile was a function of utility. And for Sloan, it was the object of desire, how he created the market. Okay. Ford created the market while Sloan and General Motors expanded it. And so it was just totally different philosophy. Ford did not believe in advertisement and sale, while General Motors went right. And one could say the American consumerism, got its start from General Motors. And again, their biggest GMAC, and those words are meaningful. General Motor Acceptance Corporations means they loan money for not just to consumers for car purchase, but also for the dealership. So initially, people had to come up with a relatively small payment type of thing. So it was a whole entire system from that was started with General Motors days, and no wonder they were able to overtake. While and both had sort of a Puritan ethics, so to speak. Okay, they were both focused on their work. They shunned interviews and exposure, and while Ford actually was directly involved in design and manufacturing, Sloan was not too keen on going on the industry floor. He stayed in his ivory tower, so to speak. Okay, and again, and both of them had streaks of anti-Semitism, and they were, even with the rise of the Nazi Germany, they were not opposed to doing business with Nazi Germany. And at Ford, obviously, as I mentioned earlier, that he started a peaceful effort in not only just in First World War, but even in Second World War. He continued to do business with the Nazi Germany, and in fact had sent a check to Adolf Hitler. And General Motors also continued their division in Germany called Opel. Became a reliable corporate citizen for Nazi Germany. Okay, and they complied with the Reich requirements. Okay, and again, so this was, and at the same time, none of them, at least GM, did not care much for the FDR's social initiative. And again, so they were behind the scene structures of American Liberty League, a racist, anti-Semitic pro-business group that were rallying Southern votes against FDR to defeat him in 1936. Okay, and so this was a lot of the who is who of American industrial empire were not exactly thrilled with the social restructuring that FDR had proposed and had successfully initiated. And some of these meetings were actually held at General Motors office in New York City. So it's a very checkered past, to make it. So it's just sobering to research some of this stuff. Okay, and again, this is just a series of number of cars. We'll just go through that. Now, the big thing as to how we create desire was, as you may recall, I mentioned a little while ago that they were working in, DuPont were the big investors, and they owned, several million stocks of General Motors. So obviously, they had a real controlling influence. And you can see how DuPont had discovered the DuCoke, which is a type of a coloring process, which is a durable, drying quickly type of paint, and that was used for the GM manufacturing lines. And obviously, that was a stark departure from only color that you can get for Model T, which was black. And obviously, that played right into the appeal to the mass market. And this was one of the very successful coating that DuPont had come up with. It was started right soon after the rise of automobile manufacturing in 1920. Okay, and again, they started using it first with spray guns. Okay, and again, so that was a hit when they showed the cars, at a New York Auto Show. It was people were standing in line to place orders. Okay, and the colors were just eye-catching, with green tanager and various natural colors, yellow. Okay, and again, the other genius that they had was they hired a guy who was a Hollywood a designer type person named Harvey Earl, and he started making clay models of the cars. So streamlined aerodynamic low-level cars were being designed instead of the boxy-looking thing with, as you recall, with Model T. So, and again, this appeal to people's vanity and object of desire, because they created something called art and color division. And not just that, they named it COLOR. Because again, remember, in the early days of 20th century, Americans looked to Europe as a sign of culture and sophistication. Okay, so this appealed directly, and that just goes along with this French-sounding names, type of thing. That even now you can realize that anything that is named shop with SHOPPE is going to be more expensive. So the same way, the colors and the names, the broom and the Cadillac names, they're all French-sounding names, so it appealed to the, to the average farmer or a factory worker, to the appeal of rising up the class ladder, that thing. And the colors were, big popular thing. So this was, and this reminds me of a story that when I was working, one of my secretaries, said, "Hi, Dr. Pathke, I bought a car." Said, "Judy, what kind of car did you buy?" "Oh, a yellow one." I said, "No, I didn't mean the what manufacturer, not the color." So it appeared, this was, and I think that I always, every day when I walk past her desk, I would say, "Yeah, what color is your car?" So there's, when after 7-8 years, she traded in another one. So this time I know it's a Datsun, okay, and with rack and pinion steering. This, so she had written out all this thing. So it's just those little stories that you miss from not working. Okay, all right, and so I think we're moving right along. Yeah. So this was, and finally, Mr. Ford did decide to catch up, at the insistence of his son, who was his sole heir. And but again, he did not listen to him, like he was a autocrat to. Excuse me. Sorry. So he finally did change his design and started putting colors to the cars. And this was, but it was a little too late, for him to catch up, type of thing. Initially, he controlled the market from 1910 all the way to 1930s, but once Model T line was redesigned, to Model A and different colors, he was never able to catch up with General Motors. But he did make some dramatic efforts that initially he shut down his plant for about six months and came up with a really state-of-the-art 8-cylinder engine. Okay, so he was, again, he kind of reinvented himself to see. Okay, and okay, and then again, obviously, the steel manufacturing we talked about, that instead of just this may shock to you that an average car has 900 pounds of steel. Okay, and some of the bigger ones maybe even more. But they modified the product by adding vanadium to make it harder, type of thing. So, and again, so this was the early start type of thing, and the race had nothing to do with this thing. So, and then from approaching the Second World War, this time, Mr. Ford and General Motors, they did see, and they did put in strong efforts to join with the effort for war and became the arsenal of democracy. And, and by that time, that assembly line had been perfected, already, and the dramatic extent. And they were able to turn out jeeps and tanks and airplanes, dramatically. And unfortunately for Ford, his son died at a young age of some simple infection or something. And he continued to manage it by himself, and hired a man called Bennett, who was actually sort of a bouncer from Detroit. And again, he ran Ford Motor Company in a very strong way, including busting unions and hiring thugs and beating up union members and automobile associate union members and the who is who type of thing. And so it's a pretty checkered past, to say. I think so. Okay, let's see. Okay, yeah, and the third person that needs to be mentioned was he was started out, by Walter Chrysler, and he again was an employee of General Motors, and then later on had fallen apart. And in contrast to Ford and Sloan that we talked about, he was a more of a people person, and he was actually directly involved in working on the shop and interacting with the workers. And so this was, the number 3. And this is just briefly summarizing the history of Chrysler Corporation, which, by the way, no longer exists. And it's, and does anybody know what happened to Chrysler Corporation? If anybody keeps up with the current news, okay. If so, speak up before I reveal. Okay, all right. Chrysler Corporation, as you know, that it just went through all the upswings, and all of us, we remember when we were younger from the Lee Iacocca days, and it got bought out by a Fiat, the Italian conglomerate. Okay, and then now a Fiat had the Franco-Italian collaboration has taken place between Peugeot and Fiat, and then they have bought out Chrysler and have rebranded as a new corporation called Stellantis, Stellantis. It's incorporated in the Netherlands from just from 2021. So that's what has happened, and they're the number 3 manufacturers now of cars in the United States. That leads me to diversify to Renaissance of Detroit again. For last 3 or 4 election cycles, Detroit has a very progressive mayor, a guy named Mr. I forget his first name. I think it's Mike Dugan. Okay, and he's a industrialist, and as you know, Detroit is 70 or 80% African American, and he's a white person, but still has won his re-election campaigns with 68% votes. So with approvals and I think, and he has really revived Detroit. Has relied the urban renewal. Like a lot of the city parks, and he was able to get this new corporation, Stellantis, built a 400 acres new plant in Detroit, with the condition that they should employ Detroit residents, not the suburbanites, or not the other part. So it has created a resurgence of car manufacturing in Detroit, which had totally shut down really after the collapse of the American car industry. So it's a remarkable person, basically. So I mean, it's an interesting term. So I mean, the guy who would make a good leader for any corporation, if you can. So it's an amazing story as to how small areas can reinvent themselves. Okay. And I read some of his interviews, type of thing, and says, "Oh, I wish I had 400 more acres so that I could, build another more revival this thing." So Detroit has really risen from the ashes this time, maybe hopefully for good. Yeah. And even Ford is building some other electrical battery plants in that area. Now again, we talked about roads, and the American roads, but the early start was the cares for the famous Autobahns of Germany. I don't know if anybody has driven on Autobahns. If so, please share your experiences and memories, type of thing. It has been on my bucket list, and someday I will do it, type of thing. Okay. And as we mentioned earlier, the start was from Mussolini, but Hitler was right on his tail. And again, I don't know whether it was initially the interest was for military purposes or not, but eventually it made a lot more difference. And he obviously provided a lot of employment starting from 1932 onwards. As many as 25,000 people were employed in building one of the first roads from Frankfurt to Darmstadt. Okay, And again, so and they were able to, and initially they're well known for having no speed limits. And again, they designed so that it would be appealed to race car drivers. Railways are usually straight and kind of boring in a way. So the autobahns had the natural curves and the tree lined. And so it was more of a freedom and independence type of thing that was incorporated. And again, so that has been one of the most successful or imitated project, that the Nazi Germany is known for. And at the same time, the German safety rate is substantially better than what we have in the United States, And there, initially, obviously, they did not have speed limits, but once in the early days when they started seeing the death, even Hitler proposed speed limits, and then later on has been eliminated. Now, if you're interested, you can get a tour package where you could they would give you a fast Porsche and you could drive on the autobahn. So there are car companies, or travel companies, so to speak, sorry, who can actually offer you the whole package of renting you a fast car. And there's a code that if you're, no matter how fast you're going on autobahns, that you'll always find somebody who is going faster than you are. Okay. And so this is an interesting story that my brother-in-law, had rented a car in Italy, and obviously, he knew the signs and symbols, but did not speak the local language. So he's tooling along at like 80, 100 or something like that, and then people are flashing from behind type thing. And finally, his son, who was 10 years or 12 years old, says, "Dad, that's in kilometers." He thought he was going at 100 miles an hour. But, so it's like, why are they flashing, type of thing. So he was in the left lane, and that's one of the worst crimes you can do on the autobahns or European highways would be, not going fast and hogging the left lane, type of thing. So, but his son corrected their dad, these marks on kilometers. And I don't know if Mike can tell, but I think Britain had one of the most confusing things. Some are in kilometers or some are in miles. I'm not sure as to how that is now, but when I traveled, I said, well, what are these marks? So maybe Mike can enlighten us as to how their markings or for speeds are in UK. Okay, I think all right. So, Mike, do you have any comments about it? Okay, let's see if our mic is there. You'd have to unmute if you wanted to chime in. Yeah, not sure who had raised hand. Oh, Bruce. Yeah, I'm sorry. Yeah, no, yeah. So I don't know.
It's the first I've heard of it, Bharat. I've driven all over Europe, but maybe it was prior to Brexit or something like that, but maybe just in modern times.
So no, but at the
I drove on the Autobahn quite a bit when I worked in Germany, and there are speed limits.
Oh yeah, now it's changed, type of thing. Now it has, I think in last few years has changed. I mean, even I think on out west also has speed limits has been imposed to some extent. So yeah, no, I think I remember that type of thing. So yeah, I think you're right. I think I didn't add that as an add-on type thing. So and so what are the speed limits now on Autobahn now?
I think it's 140. That's
140.
kilometers.
Okay, so it's still
I lived there for 2 years, so I drove it fairly regularly, and they might even flash you at 100 miles an hour. There are speed limits, but I never heard of anybody getting a speeding ticket. I mean, lots of people drive regularly at 100 miles an hour, so it's not the same environment. And in the wintertime, they have fog, and they have these horrendous crashes where, they all pile up on a foggy morning because they're all going so fast.
But still, their driver's requirement and training is far more difficult than what we have in the United States.
Yeah, I don't know about that because
the training program is it's separate. They take it seriously, type of thing. So I think that it's not like you just go and like, because I was, talking to somebody at like, the passing a driver's test here, doesn't really take too much of an effort type of thing, like, and so that's, but the German driver's license training is fairly strict, so to speak, like, yeah, that's what I remember reading about it type of thing. So this, okay, I think that's,
Yes, I was in Germany for a year in 1970, working from St. Louis, and I had about 50 Americans over there who wanted to see ladies bathing in the nude, and they got to see that, but they also got to see a lot of speeding tickets. And, so that was in 1970, and that's quite some time ago. And and if they, thought, wow, we're going back to the States, they won't catch you. Yeah, but then they would return to Germany, and they'd be arrested as they come in the country for an outstanding speeding ticket. So be careful. Okay.
Okay, all right. So I think we'll get onto this after talking a little bit about this thing. This is obviously everybody will recognize this. And this was the idea of the people's car, or Volkswagen, as we get to know it. It was designed by Ferdinand Porsche. And he was actually originally of Czech nationality, and became, a darling or favorite of Adolf Hitler, and then later on renounced the Czech citizenship and became a Nazi party member. And again, so this was the start of, obviously, when, and I'll have more slide to say, and this became the darling of the culture. And you can remember this, Herbie, the movie, the Disney movie. Okay, so this is, and we think that Model T was the most successful car, but Volkswagen has had manufactured even more and was in production for even longer. And it's an interesting story that I'm sure it's well known, but it needs to be told. And so this is just the modern picture of the German highways. Okay. And the whole idea is to, that you may recognize the German word Kraft du Freudwagen. It's work through joy. And so this was, again, the Nazi era things, the biggest problem that I have with the Nazi era, this thing, is that they hijacked the swastika. Okay. Again, so before we take a break, I'll tell the story that my aunt is not very religious, but she, again, just, let's see, had a calendar, or actually a picture of one of the Hindu deity with swastika. And when her son was in school, one of the school volunteers or social workers or somebody came, and they looked at the swastika, and they were just, you could just see that they were uncomfortable or this thing. So my aunt had to explain that swastika has been used in Hindu culture for 3,000 years, and it's around in a lot of other cultures, European cultures, and other areas, in Buddhist cultures, So that's one of the things as to how swastika got maligned, with their incorporation with the Nazi philosophy. Okay, and this is some of this thing that he started. It was one of the clever idea of raising funds and at the same time starting manufacturing, was that they came up with the idea in the early days of Nazi Germany that they heard about in America, every worker had the car, so German workers should have a car also. So with a cost was settled at 990 Deutschmark, that to pay in advance 5 Reichsmarks per week. Okay, and as many as 250,000 people did pay between 38 and 39, and for start of the factory in Lower Saxony. Okay, and again, unfortunately, with the start of the war in 39, none of the regular citizens ever actually got take possession of the car, because with the onset of the war, the whole manufacturing, the car design was retooled and as a bucket car, and revived production as something called Kubbelwagen, as called bucket car, and was totally turned to war manufacturing. And after the war, this was during the war manufacturing, they had a lot of slave employment, and the entire plant was offered to Britain, okay, as a war repatriation or whatever. It's just like we just managed to capture a lot of the scientists. It was captured, but the British industry that was in the heydays in the 50s for car manufacturing, they looked down upon it. They turned it down. Said, yes, that would not work for our purposes. So they turned down the whole production. And then finally, what U.S. administrator, who was actually a car fan, he revived the production and appointed one German engineer, and they slowly started production. The rest is history for success of Volkswagen. Okay, so I'll show you this. So again, this is a picture for historical records as to how he was directly involved in manufacturing process. Okay. I think we should take a break. We are moving right along, type of thing.
Can I just add?
Oh, please, go ahead. Yeah.
In Germany, yes, you could pay for 5 years. You put money down for 5 years.
Zoom recording, and yes, this is now. I don't know. It's like as maligned or checkered an abhorrent past may be. This was the car. That was the Mercedes-Benz 770 Grosser Offer Tourwagen. It was a very rare 1939 Mercedes-Benz. That was the last offer for public sale in 2017. It had several owners, and this was offered at a public sale. Auction price was $7 million. And then somebody ended up buying for it. After several years of negotiation. Adolf Hitler used this armored limousine for 3 years on official appearances in various conquered countries. It was powered by a 7-liter, 8-cylinder engine with 230 horsepower, which is impressive in those days, capable of going up to 100 kilometers and max out at 190 kilometers. Okay, so they're just impressive for that time, type of thing, and because it's a heavy car, it wasn't a race car by any means, So again, so this was piece of historiana type of thing. Okay, and again, as we talked about, as the arsenal of democracy during the war, all the companies really jumped right into it, and that led to the victory on both sides. And the amount of manufacturing that is was just phenomenal. Which some of us just took the class, on Japan and the European War Theater, and this was amazing how they were able to turn out planes in like 2 hours flat time, and again, this was the start of the war. The military had set out a contract for an all-purpose vehicle, and that was competed by various manufacturers, and Willis and Bentham came up with, and there was a rise of the Jeep as we have come to know it. And so there were small companies, they were not big enough, so Ford jumped into it, and Jeep became the iconic Second World War, and almost like a mythological reputation for toughness, durability, and it replaced the horses to know it, So, and so then again, so they'd asked for a car, 4-wheel drive car, so they designed it in almost less than a week, and the rest is history as to how much impact it had in the course of the war. Okay, and it made all over the world, basically China, Asia, in all the theaters. Okay, and this was, because so you can see it has been used for varieties of purposes. I think early production went to production as GP. G is a government, stands for government contract, and P was to designate a car with a certain amount of wheel balance, and was one of the most earliest production models that the Ford got into. I think so. And again, along with cars, this was the rise of the car culture. We'll have several slides to talk about it. And this is, of all places, in South, a place came up named Kirby's Pig Stand. So this was, I think, in Dallas, if my memory serves correctly, type thing. So it was as early as 1921, way before McDonald's, I think. And so this was, you can just see people are pulling up to the car, type thing, car hops, and neon signs with chicken, fried steak, as many as 5,000 per day. And now, and then subsequently, varieties of people imitated that idea, including White Castle, okay, and varieties of the fast food chains came into power, type thing. And now we know it has dramatically changed. We've come a long way from that we've come up with the idea of having a one-handed convenience. And not only that, on the go cup holders. And the one way of popularity of car is how many cup holders it has. And even the food production has been revised that, I mean, this is almost takes the cake, a hexagonal taco, so we can have a finger food, so to speak, And so this is, and so this was, and then a lot of that from the car hops, we change it to a drive-through lane, which gives, and now I don't know how well it is, but actually they have a artificial intelligence algorithms basically that can almost predict what going to order based on the car that you are pulling in. And sometimes they can even identify your license plate and see if you're a repeat customer. And the greeting is done by an AI generated sound rather than a real human being, at some of the drive-throughs. Okay, so it's, we've come a long way from Kirby's Pig Stand, which was one of the early days of fast food as we've come to know it. And obviously, with the rise of roads, we needed a place to stay. And this was the rise of the early motel that was started in San Luis Obispo. Okay, and that's in, so this was started. And who were being a purist or Puritan did not look too kindly on it and categorize them as crime and sex dens. But again, obviously, he was behind his time type of thing. And there were, from the early days of starting, in about 40 years, there were thousands and thousands of chains, so it's a whole industry. And that's been, now this, you may or you may not know this, but this ties in with the immigration story that a lot of the Patels, which are the Asian Indians, when they were chased out of by Idi Amin, they were able to buy a small motel, and as long as they provide employer for about six or seven people, so family employment, other part-time employment. So almost 60 to 70% of motel business is owned by the Patels, who are from South Asia, i.e. India. That, it's a huge, obviously, and as it happens quite often, that the earlier people, started the business, but the kids are no longer interested in running the same business, as it happens sometimes in farming. But some of them have manufactured, have got into, hospitality industries and have gotten their MBAs. And so they're a big force, just to digress. And last but not the least, who doesn't remember this picture from Psycho, from Norman and his mother, who ran a motel that was ruined by the rise of the freeway that came in. And so that was the classic Hitchcock movie that all of us grew up with. Okay. And again, these are some of the speed cars just for day. And when I thought, it may not interest all of you type of thing, but these are some of the luxury cars. And I mentioned a little bit about the race culture, especially among the rich Brits, where they were called the Bentley boys that I talked about in the bonus lecture that I saw. And one of the fewest, the rarest car was Bugatti Royale. Only a very few were manufactured. And so this was during the heydays, luxury days before the Depression type of thing. And again, last but not the least, now the only thing that is remotely comparable is Rolls-Royce Phantom 7, that stayed in production for about 14 years, And so this is, and so Bugatti Royale was one of the earliest ones type of thing. And so, and some of them were just crazy racers. They raced against the blue train, okay, and so it was, memorized in the people who are filthy rich, to put it mildly, okay. And again, not to be done, remember the original manufacturers were the French, so then this was one of the classic cars, which is Citroën DS, that came about it somehow did not do well in United States for whatever reasons, but was far ahead of its time. It was a front-wheel drive company, which is owned by Michelin. It had hydraulic suspension, and it was a world-class engineering type of thing. And I mentioned a little bit earlier in my first lecture about Mr. André Citroën, who suffered heavily because of his Jewish ancestry, type of thing. And he was way ahead of his time type in manufacturing. And ultimately, he was bailed out by his friend Michelin's, as we talked about. On the other hand, Peugeot and Renault, who collaborated with the Nazis and but rehabilitated or were over their sets or overlooked, and they're still very much a big force in European car manufacturing to be reckoned with. And as I mentioned earlier, they're part of the Fiat the Italian empire, the Stellantis that we talked about a little while ago. Okay, and these are some of the things. So we'll just gloss over this, Okay, and again, we talked earlier about the attraction for the European names that we talked about. Okay, and last but not the least, there was an interesting movie about Tucker cars, which was Tucker 48, was produced in Ypsilanti and Chicago. And it again was a design ahead of its time, for crash protection, roll bar. And again, but there was some wheeling dealing about the stocks, and he was run out of business finally, so never really succeeded. And I think there was a interesting movie made about his lifestyle. I think it was Jeff Bridges or Bo Bridges. I can never keep those two guys apart. But it's an interesting movie for car manufacturing. Okay. And again, it's like obviously a lot of you have grown up with this, so I don't need to elaborate this thing. But in 1944, this was a famous picture from the pictorial magazine Life about the invention of the teenager, how the girls, how the courting procedure changed dramatically with the availability of cars and the freedom that incorporated, that instead of calling on gentlemen calling on to the lady and sitting under watchful eyes of the parents, that became totally different. It changes the mores of America. Okay, and as early as 1910, driving theaters coming around, fast food, we talked about car hops, filling station, and along with that, supermarkets were started. Surprisingly, more in South. Piggly Wiggly came into existence as early as 1916 in, of all places, Memphis, Tennessee. The first supermarket that we came to know about came in Jamaica, Queens, and there was somebody who was one of Piggly Wiggly's employee, started a larger store called King Cullen. Okay, and then earlier malls, they came into existence in Kansas City, 1923, and the most enclosed mall was much later, and Southdale Center. That I'll have some slides for that. There was the enclosed mall, and which became, so there's a whole story of it. And post-World War, the manufacturing idea was borrowed by the home builders, Mr. William Jared Levitt. He was born in 1907, and then with the return of the GIs, he started manufacturing houses. They're not home builders, but manufacturers. So this was he bought up, it was the starting of the Levitt town. And you can see how the baby boom, and it started manufacturing, along with, house, a yard, and a Chevy. So that was the American dream for the baby boomer generation. And the price was, not small, but was affordable to most people. It was like $8,000 for a home with, only 5% down payment, but even less, it's almost zero for wets type of thing. And so that started the commuter culture, like majority of people commuted to New York City, I think so. And so this was, again, so this was a difference between the suburbia culture between the UK and other parts of the world, to the United States type of thing. So, and UK still used railways and built, smaller towns around it. But the United States, there was a total decline of the railways along with the rise of the freeway culture. So this was, and again, there are varieties of people came up with ideas of building. Some ideas were originally very good, but they kind of backfired. As early as 1898, people who were doing urban planning had come up with the ideas of building so-called garden cities in the center area for exchange with radial avenues, somewhere like Paris, in post-Napoleonic era type of thing. And, there was Forest Hill, New York was built. Le Corbusier had a different idea of elevated highways going cross town, type of thing. But again, some of these ideas were good on paper, but never materialized, basically, because a lot of the destruction of the cities that took place with the rise of suburbia cultures that took place, type of thing. So, okay. And it grew, suburbs started to grow almost 8 to 10 times faster than the city, type thing. And along with that, slum clearance. And obviously, as it happened before the civil rights era, there was a huge, emphasis on slum clearance, and the decline of the public transportation of streetcars that was available, so, and it happened that, that people who are, the African Americans had said, the roads for the whites were built through the houses of the black people, that thing. And again, there was obviously the giving loans for home ownership was again, somewhat, restricted to whites only. So it was a dramatic, division that was taking place, right post-war, and it continued and maybe even continues even now, type of thing. And some of the stories that you hear, back, from the 50s are just mind-boggling type of thing. And just to digress, I'll tell you a story about one of my uncles who had come to do for a PhD in pharmacy in Los Angeles, and he was friends with the African American person in LA, and they wanted to share an apartment, and says, "No, you can stay, but he can't." And he's brown skinned and a foreigner, but at the same time, somebody was born here, and was, wanted an apartment, not in Deep South, but in Los Angeles, was turned down back in the 60s. Okay. So that was, some of the legacies that just brings to mind, type of thing. And again, traveling, another relative of mine, like he was, they were traveling through rural Tennessee, and they stopped by to see, sidewalk, because they like dogs, and somebody had a nice dog, so they wanted to talk to the dog. In the garage, they saw a Klan outfit, So obviously, these people were, really just taken aback, when they saw. And the owner said, "Oh no, that's not for you guys. You guys are all right." Okay, I think they stopped taking the side roads in Tennessee. This was back in the 70s. Okay, so this is the stories of on the road in America, that people who are Asian Indian ancestry have experienced. Okay, and this is the golden age. As to the advances came in fast. With the rise of automatic transmission, power steering, tubeless towers, windows. Okay, turnpikes, shopping centers, the famous Holiday Inn. Okay, McDonald's. And again, obviously, I'm sure quite a few of you have seen movies. And this is again, I think, unfortunately, I think you can't read the sign, but in June 1957, Reverend Robert Schuller and his Garden Grove Community Service at Orange County Drive-In Church. Okay, so this was no permanent building, so drive-in service. So you can just see that, this was okay. And so, so in the early 50s, 75% of the cars in the world were in United States, and selling anywhere from 7 million per year, type of thing. So, okay. And the big changes that took place, type of things. And then varieties of national identity can be incorporated into car culture. United States, obviously, big and brash. Italians, racy and flashy. Okay, Brits, well-built and sedate, so type of thing. So it can just say what is good for General Motors is good for United States, Okay, so let's see what I have here. Yeah, this is the image of the drive-in theater in the early days. You can just see the all identical looking automobiles. And again, there's, finally the 1970s caught up with us, type of thing. And again, this jogs my memory, when I was a resident, some of the nice good old Jewish boys from Detroit who were in training with me at Sinai, Detroit, were complaining about standing in the car, for the standing line in the cars. So I had to just shake my hand and say, Steve, chill out, like in the rest of the world, people stand in line for basic necessities, and here you're sitting in an air conditioning car waiting for 10 minutes, you're grumbling about. So I think it was an interesting how different perspective people had about standing in line. Okay, and again, so this is probably well known to all of you, but as for sake of completeness, one should mention it. Okay, and the Eisenhower, as you may recall, as when he was a colonel from type of thing, like he was taking a cross-country moving trip, was challenging type of thing. He started out from, I think, St. Louis or something, or DC, which was covering, personnel and this thing. And he was frustrated as to how poorly equipped we were in case of a West Coast invasion. So when he became president, he obviously, he decided to do the coast to coast, national highway plan. So the commission was appointed, again, obviously that had big impetus was not just to reduce for national security, but also the fringe benefit was also the reducing the fatalities that were occurring. Again, and remember that this was before seatbelts, type of thing. And again, that it just changed the shape of the structure of the United States as we know it, and the trucks became the big mode of transportation with the decline of the railroad. And people, the famous Cannonball movies, people who completed in 26 hours, and I'm sure, they had porta potties, along with it, that thing. So 26 hours, 38 minutes from New York to LA. I mean, that is some crazy driving. And in the early days, some car and driver had taken, they had built in fuel tanks and they had done some of these runs, so it takes, fits in right in with the American passion for driving. And perhaps one of the reasons for high fatality driving is because we drive a lot more than other countries. Average American drives anywhere from 7 to 10,000, while the Japanese drives 1,100 miles. Okay, so this was the construction, that it's debatable as to where it started. The first section of interstate highway began in Missouri. Okay, and then later other states have also competing claims as to they were the first to propose sections. So, right, so it's just like states have their own extra grind type of thing. So this was the grand plan that was obligated to spend $50 billion of federal funds over 10 years for interconnected highways type of thing. So, and the cost was, considering the time, it was really affordable for the gigantic U.S. economy that was booming post-war, was 1.1 million per mile. Okay, and so again, so this was again by this time, the railways were in steep decline, and again the Greyhound, the bus manufacturing was owned by General Motors, so they had their finger in the pie on more ways than one. Okay, and again, so this is, it just surprises me as to how many well-meaning citizens have no idea about how the numbering system is laid about. I was just, shaking the head type of thing as to how many people, have difficulty as to east-west versus north-south, when clueless type of thing. Okay. So what killed public transport? So this is something that you can just see, the railroad networks, United States versus Europe. Okay, and it's pretty obvious. Okay, type of thing with the decline of the railroad industry. We are totally dependent upon automobiles and truck drivers. I think so. And just to digress, Green Bay was the headquarters for the Schneider National. So I had to see a lot of these truck drivers, for their physical, and they'll be on the road for a whole week. So I had to agree to see them after they come back on Friday after 4 o'clock. Doc, I get back after 4. Can you see me after that? Sure, come on. I think so. So it was a, it provided a huge employment. And again, I think I put this together from some images that I copied from InMobile. So a lot of you have owned, some of you may have owned some of these cars, but hopefully let's see if this plays. You may remember this movie. I think that was the last one. So it showed that this was a design for tomorrow. And this was idea that the GM designer, primarily a guy named Earl, he borrowed that from P-38, the planes that they were designing type of thing. And so Harvey Earl, he was the big designer for General Motors and chief of the art and color division. And along with that, so so they borrowed the idea from fighter planes and other planes that were made for Second World War. and so the fiends, it did not actually have any purpose except for this cute looking type of thing. And it became the vogue, and the manufacturers started to outdo one after the other. And the bigger and bigger, it just exponentially, it continued further. And I'm sure some of you may have even owned some of these type of cars, or at least I'm sure, or at least minimum ridden them with your mom and dad. Okay. And so this is, okay. And there are variety, and then again, later on, the biggest sports car venture that General Motors had was one Corvette, that was designed by fiberglass type of sports car that was designed, okay, to go at speed. And there's a museum of that near Kentucky, where it was manufactured. And unfortunately, I think in a few years ago, was hit by a tornado, and was a lot of the classic cars were destroyed. Okay, and so that was the piece of Americana that has gone by now. Okay, and yeah, one of you mentioned as to how Ford Edsel. Okay, there was Edsel, as you may recall, was his son, and this was his brainchild, so to speak. And some marketing was done by some who is who of Hollywood, including Bing Crosby and Frank Sinatra. But they had not done enough market research as to how this would be received, by general public. And the design was maligned as to reminded people of horse collar and grill, and or even to get crude, of some body parts, so to speak, and the large headlines type of thing. And it cost them $300 million, type of thing. And again, it was a big disaster for bad marketing. Okay, and that brings us to Corsair and Ralph Nader, which I have. It's coming up in next slides type of thing. Okay, and then again. And then again, at the same time, they were following, this was the rise of Japan, which we'll have talk about in a new fruit size is coming up type of thing. And that we talked about, Taylorism earlier, as you may recall, and Fordism, but the Japanese outdid them, and they came to learn the American mass manufacturing techniques. A guy named Ono, which is a very common Japanese name, he came and devised the work for Toyota, and did the manufacturing process. But again, with a little bit more human face, and became more successful and outdid the teachers. The student outdid the teacher, so to speak. Okay, and this was and so so that was the rise of Japan and decline of America as we come to know it, type of thing. And at the same time, it played right into their hands with the fuel crisis and the oil embargoes that took place. So just the history that all of us have lived through, type of thing. Okay, and the Corvair, actually, okay, we'll have say a little bit about that. It relied on pressure differential between the front and rear, so tire pressures had to be different between the different tires. So if we inflated all the tires equally, as most people are used to do, it creates something called an oversteer. And so, and they tried to put some anti-roll bars and other stuff, but again, they were reluctant to spend extra money on safety measures. And so there was a design was quite attractive for the Corsair type of thing, but again, the safety issue. And Ralph Nader was an Ivy League trained lawyer. Okay, and again, the car had a tendency to spin around and roll badly, type of thing. So, and unfortunately, it is an example of corporate stupidity. They tried to discredit Ralph Nader, guy, president of General Motors, a chap named James Roche. He tried to discredit him with inquiries, type of thing. And unfortunately, Nader was able to see through it through contact with some senators and Senate inquiry, and Roche had to apologize. And then that was the and they were also fined. So that was the decline of the saga of Corsair and Ralph Nader. And Ralph Nader, I'm sorry, go ahead, please.
Oh, no, I was just going to say I had a Corvair, and they were very fun to drive in snowstorms. On
okay. In what way? What happened actually? Did they just spin around, or?
Yeah, that was what we set out to do. We tried to see how many 360s we could do in the silly things. Yeah.
Oh my! And that was that in the Indianapolis Speedway or on the regular street?
Well, it was Indianapolis, and it was kind of around the speedway, but it wasn't. I wasn't racing.
I know. I'm just dealing. Yeah, I knew that. It happened to us when in Green Bay in one of the ice storms on, the bridges freeze before things. So we're coming from a Christmas party, and I think I don't know what I had. I had a Audi or something. And I spun around 180 degrees on the bridge.
Yeah.
And pulled up on the side, like, because there is nothing and like driving on ice. I'm sure you've experienced in ice in Indiana.
Oh, very much so.
Yeah, there's like, and I think I did 2 years in Louisville, Kentucky, and I missed more days of work in Louisville than I did in all 30 years in Green Bay, because they did not know how to handle the snow. So just, when it become ice, so Louisville was just. And I think that's probably the only time I rode in a bus in the United States. Okay, so I went to work, from my flat, from my apartment to downtown Louisville in a bus, that thing. So, okay, because the buses were still able to run. So, okay, and obviously all of us remember this. The Ford Pinto. That was, I think, this is. Let's see if this plays. That's the one video is.
In 1970, the Ford Motor Company unveiled their first ever subcompact sedan, the Pinto. Consumers loved the Pinto. There was just one small problem. Even the tiniest of fender benders could ignite the car into a fiery blaze. Buckle up, because today we are exploring the weird history of the completely preventable disaster of the exploding Ford Pinto. But before we get started, be sure to subscribe to the Weird History channel and let us know in the comments below what other automotive topics you would like to hear about. Okay, be sure to fasten your seatbelt for this little explosive car story. Out of the 11 Pintos crash tested before its release, 8 of them were found to have ruptured fuel tanks in crashes of at least 25 miles per hour. The 3 Pintos without ruptured fuel tanks were spared due to incredibly cheap but extremely efficient structural alterations, like placing a plastic baffle between the tank and the differential housing, keeping the bolts on the housing from puncturing the tank. To clarify, Ford was 8 for 8 when it came to unaltered Pintos rupturing their fuel tanks in any crash above 25 miles an hour. This was concerning to Ford executives, who quickly ordered the structural alterations before its release.
910. That's the number of quality inspections that are made during the assembly of Ford's new Pinto.
Ha, no, not at all. They released the cars anyway. They skipped the $11 per car fix because, well, nobody wanted to displease the boss. Lee Iacocca was a fast-rising executive within the Ford Motor Company. As an assistant sales manager, he found nationwide recognition for his 56 for 56 initiative, offering loans on 1956 model year cars with a 20% down payment and $56 in monthly payments for 3 years. It was just that kind of out-of-the-box thinking that would soon elevate Lee to president of Ford. Even before his rise to president, Lee was greatly concerned about the rise of foreign compact cars. Japanese and German cars, like the Volkswagen Beetle, were giving Americans an alternative to the big and bulky vehicles made by domestic manufacturers. Lee was determined to make a subcompact American car, one that would explode onto the scene, and he would do it all in record time. The average amount of time between a new car's initial conception to its final product is about 43 months. But Lee wanted his subcompact sedan in showrooms by the fall of 1970. That left just 25 months to develop and release the Ford Pinto. This is thought to be the fastest turnaround for the development and release of a new car in automotive history. They did it with hard work, ingenuity, and cutting every possible corner. When designing an automobile, the tooling process is the crucial period in which engineers develop, fine-tune, and finalize each one of the approximately 500,000 parts that go into making the car. Once the company knows which parts are needed, they hand their orders over to a tooling company that designs and develops the tools necessary to create the needed parts. Now, usually the tooling company doesn't begin making those parts until each part has been finalized, and the engineers are certain all of the parts will all fit together. But as we will come to see, the production of the Pinto was anything but usual. The tooling process, which typically takes about 18 months, happened simultaneously with the development of the Pinto. That means engineers were figuring out which parts were needed and how to make those parts all at the same time. If you were to buy a Lego set, you'd open the box and find pre-packaged Lego bricks along with an instruction manual for how to piece them together. But imagine opening the box for Bowser's Castle and finding a picture of the castle with a small note saying, Step 1, make some Legos and figure out how to turn them into this castle. Step 2, enjoy. That's basically what the Pinto engineers were forced to work with. That's why it's no wonder the defective fuel tank wasn't noticed until well into production. And when it was finally discovered, nobody at the company had the nerve to tell the boss. As one former engineer told Mother Jones, that person who would have warned Iacocca would have been fired. Safety wasn't a popular subject around Ford in those days. With Lee, it was taboo. Whenever a problem was raised that meant a delay on the Pinto, Lee would chomp on a cigar, look out the window and say, read the product objectives and get back to work. Those objectives were twofold. One, Iacocca insisted that the Pinto could not weigh more than 2,000 pounds. And two, it could not cost more than $2,000. Just like with his 56-56 campaign, Lee Iacocca had a hankering for number symmetry. The so-called limits of 2,000 meant that even an $11 per car fix was completely out of the question. Hindsight is 20/20, but for Lee Iacocca, foresight was simply 2,000.
Ford's Pinto is priced like a small economy import, but it's frisky.
Early marketing for the Ford Pinto announced it as the little carefree car. Advertisements told customers that by buying a Ford Pinto, they could leave their cares about high prices, maintenance, and value at the door.
Easy repairs, inexpensive parts, or you can change bumpers or fenders quicker than those other cars can.
Unfortunately, there was a small subset of the population who also cared about not being burned alive. And those customers really should have been directed towards a Pontiac. The Ford Pinto went on sale in mid-September of 1970. By late October, the company was forced to recall 26,000 vehicles due to a design flaw in which the accelerator would tend to stick when the throttle was opened up more than halfway. This was the first Pinto recall, but it wouldn't be the last. One of the Ford Pinto's many design flaws allowed gas and fumes to accumulate underneath the car's hood, where an electrical spark would eventually trigger an explosion. After receiving reports of over 100 such explosions, Ford reluctantly pulled the trigger and issued its second Pinto recall within 5 months. Ford claimed that there were no injuries in these explosions, but that was a line of defense that they would not be able to hold on to for very long. Dennis Gioia was the head of Ford's recall division back in 1973, when the first reports of crash-related explosions started rolling in. In 2016, Gioia told Corporate Crime Reporter, "I'm used to getting 25 to 50 reports before I act to recommend a recall of a car. The Pinto file never got more than 5 reports." Regardless, Gioia claims to have expressed a desire to recall the Pinto after seeing the burnt-out remains of a crashed Pinto firsthand. Citing a lack of evidence, the recall office decided not to pursue a recall of Lee Iacocca's pet project. But once Gioia and others saw a copy of the infamous Pinto memo, the recall office switched their gears. The memo clearly stated that engineers had discovered the dangerous and potentially fatal fuel tank flaw while running crash tests 3 years earlier, before the car's initial release. This was a game changer. But even with this damning evidence, Gioia was told to hold off from issuing a recall, or worse, going to the press. He was assured by his higher-ups that the company was undergoing rigorous testing of the car in question, making sure it was safe, if not safer, than its competitors, and he was told to wait for the results. When Ford came back and said that the car was indeed safe, Mr. Gioia took them at their word, despite knowing that they had lied about their safety testing just 3 years earlier.
Pinto, it may be the best small car buy in America. At your Ford dealer.
While the official total is 27, other estimates, not by Ford, put the death toll anywhere from 180 to 500. Also not known is how many other people were injured or killed when the Ford Pintos suddenly burst into flames. What is clear is that Ford knew about the deadly defect in their engines and sat on the information, hoping they could settle lawsuits out of court, and without having to issue an expensive recall. When investigative outlet Mother Jones obtained a copy of the rumored Pinto memo in 1977, they published an article they called Pinto Madness, which showed the world what Ford executives had been hiding all along. Ford released the Pinto knowing it was defective, because an $11 per car fix would have cost the company $121 million, since they already had 11 million fiery death traps ready to go. In contrast, it would cost Ford just $50 million to settle lawsuits out of court. It's pretty straightforward math, if math is all you care about. Up until the Mother Jones expose, the first rule of the Pinto memo was, you don't talk about the Pinto memo. But
Okay, so I mean that is very enormous. The reason I played the whole thing was it is really shocking as to how corporate greed, played a role. Okay, I mean it's just unreal type of thing as to. Okay, and I think at this time again, the U.S. was really in the decline. We're making some really bad cars. That Chevy had a Vega. On the other hand, the small AMC, American Motor Corporation, which was an amalgamation of Hudson and some of the other companies from the 40s. Okay, they're more successful with their car called Gremlin. Okay, so this is, and again, this brings us to the question of capitalism as to how much should government intervene. The same Iacocca and Chrysler, when they were going bankrupt, the US government bailed them out. And as to say, I mean, it really brings to the question, and I don't know if all of you received the okay, oh yeah, and yeah, sure, I'll send you the link. So Anne was saying she was leaving, so okay, all right. So I just let me know type of thing as to if you received that bonus thing, because by sheer coincidence, The Economist, one of my favorite weekly magazines, had a whole issue on the car industry, that type of thing, as to the changes that are rapidly taking place with the rise of the electric automobiles all over the world, and how the whole paradigm is shifted. So there was a whole thing. So I don't know how many, whether Now, don't share it with anybody because it was my personal issue, and I copied it and I sent it out. And actually, I had created some slides because it was like 20 pages, and not all of you would have the interest or the time to read that. So, but I had compiled it in a smaller slides as the succinct point that they outlined in the articles. They're like a series of 7 or 8 articles. They are separate. So, did everybody get that, or somebody has not received it?
Haven't yet.
Oh, you haven't? I see.
No.
Huh?
I got it, yeah.
Oh, you did. Okay, yeah. So just check in your spam type of thing, you know. Otherwise, I'll send it out again, you know, if you want type thing. So I think I'm going to send out. So this is, you know, the whole thing about. Now I think we are coming up to
Once
3.
the article drops,
Okay, and I think we should probably, you know, stop a few minutes earlier type of thing because I have about 50 or 60 slides type of thing, so I can go on further. But I think I zip through that faster than. Okay. I don't think I skipped anything more, but that thing. I'm going to stop the screen share for the time being, type of thing, and just say up. I'll just open if you unmute, and if anybody has any comments, questions, recommendations, or personal experiences, please jump in, type of thing. So, and I will send out the slides and other stuff again, type of thing. So, but the articles in The Economist magazine were really very interesting to see as to how the car manufacturing is being changed there, and the rise of the dragon, China versus United States, in terms of, because we may think Tesla is the biggest manufacturers, but alas, that's no longer the case. You know, one of the Chinese company, BYD, is the leader now. So in terms of number of EVs manufactured, and they own a huge number of European, their partnerships, and the varieties of roles that are being played by the Arab financier. So the whole industry is changing right before our eyes, you know, type of thing. So it's a worthwhile reading thing. But I think, you know, if you don't have the time to read, you know, the series of articles, then and for those of you who want to spend more times, you know, as I always mentioned, Florida has bad schools, but we have great libraries. So you can read The Economist through the local library, you know. If you go through books and magazines and go through his thing, you'll find the whole issue of Economist, because otherwise it's a pretty expensive subscription generally, you know, type thing. So I think I'll stop here, type of thing, in terms of and stick around for any questions, comments. And I think just request or offer, whatever, if you want to call it, if I mean, I have a few slides, but I think if Bruce wants to take time in the second half and talk a little bit about the driverless cars, you know, I think, I don't know if everybody has attended that or not. I think, I know, and Mike and I did, you know, Bruce Gobioff did an excellent class about, I should say, probably almost last year sometime, or before that. Or I think Bruce did. I don't know. I don't remember when he did the class, but
It was actually fairly recently. It was called Artificial Intelligence and Self-Driving Cars.
Yeah. So I think,
yeah.
so if you just wanted to focus, you know, because the artificial intelligence may be too complex type of thing, you know, but I think if you wanted to, you know, take some time and share, you know, give it a thought, you know, otherwise you can send me an email.
I'll be happy to do that.
Yeah, I think it'll be nice, you know, we can share, because, you know, you've already done lots of work on it, so I don't have
I've already
to,
got the slides, so it's
yeah, exactly.
really no work for me.
Because I have only a very few slides about the 6 stages of driving and
right.
Yeah,
why don't you send me the slides you have so I don't do anything redundant
yeah, oh sure, I'll be
on
glad
that
to.
subject. Just
So,
on
yeah,
that.
yeah, I
Okay,
think I have a
thanks.
few of these things. So
Okay.
all right. So I think we're coming up to our witching hour type of thing. So I think, you know, we have a time to break for martini or a glass of beer, as we said, as we want to, type of thing. So okay, thank you folks for sticking around, and I had fun. Oh yeah, go ahead, Nick,
Bye-bye.
please. Okay, are you waving bye or saying, or you have a question? Oh, okay, I think. All right, thank you, Ron and Bob. Okay, I think it was a pleasure.
Thank you, Brett, always.
Okay, all right, and let's see. I'll stop recording. Yep.